Direct and indirect questions. How to use and construct them in English. In a typical English question, the auxiliary comes first and the subject pronoun or noun comes second. This is called a direct question. But in English, there are direct questions and indirect questions. In an indirect question, the subject is first and the auxiliary is second. This is called inversion. And it's the same for the auxiliary to be, to have, and the negative of the auxiliary to do. Questions with modal verbs operate in the same way. Direct question, indirect question. The only exception is with the auxiliary verb do in positive. If a direct question contains do in positive, in an indirect question, the verb do disappears. Direct, indirect. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Are you happy? A typical direct question, but direct questions can appear rude and informal in English. If we want to be more polite, we can say something like, do you know if? And now we change the position of the auxiliary and the subject pronoun. Do you know if you are happy? This is now an indirect question because we're not starting with an auxiliary verb, we're starting with an indirect phrase. We can use many different indirect phrases. For example, do you know? Do you have any idea? Can you tell me? But the important thing to remember is that now we're not starting with the auxiliary verb. An exception to this rule is when we use the indirect phrase, do you think? When we start an indirect question with, do you think, we don't use if. And these kinds of direct and indirect questions can appear in any tenses. For example, is he or she watching TV? This is a direct question in present continuous tense. If we want to construct an indirect version of this question, we choose an indirect phrase, add if, invert our auxiliary verb and subject pronoun, and we now have a polite and indirect question. Changing the indirect phrase, we can create many different indirect questions. Normally, the indirect phrase is a question, but sometimes it can be a declaration or a statement. So the order will be subject, auxiliary, verb, and object, like a normal sentence. So we have direct questions, indirect questions, and declarations or statements that follow the order of a normal sentence. And it works exactly the same for any perfect tense. For example, have you been to London? This is a direct question because we're starting with the auxiliary verb. Imagine if we want to be more polite, we could say, do you know if you have been to London? Now, this is a polite and indirect question. But remember, if we use do you think in our indirect phrase, then we don't use if. The same rule of inversion applies with modal verbs. Can I open the present? If we want to be more polite, we can say, do you know if, invert the modal and the subject, if I can open the present. And now, because we're starting with an indirect phrase, we have an indirect question. If we start with the modal again, we have a direct question. Now for the exception to this inversion rule. Do you like chocolate? This is a direct question. We're starting with the auxiliary verb do in positive. To make this more polite or indirect, let's start with an indirect phrase. Can you tell me? If, and now we don't invert the auxiliary verb and the subject. Because the verb is do in positive, in an indirect question, we omit it. Direct question with do in positive, indirect question, no do. Another example using the auxiliary verb do in positive could be, does he or she like chocolate? Direct question. For a more polite version, we could say something like, do you know if, omit do in positive, and now because we have the pronoun he or she, we take the S from the auxiliary verb and put it with the main verb. So we have, do you know if he or she likes chocolate? In a similar way, did he like chocolate in the past could change to, do you know if, cross out did, he or she, and change the verb like to the past. Do you know if he or she liked chocolate? A direct question can start with an auxiliary, but it can also start with a question word. If a direct question starts with an auxiliary, the indirect question has if after the indirect phrase. If the question starts with a question word, if is not used when forming the indirect question. Let's look at an easier example. Are you happy? And why are you happy? In the first example, we're starting with an auxiliary verb, and in the second, we're starting with a question word. If we convert a direct question that starts with an auxiliary verb into an indirect question, we add if. And if we convert a direct question that starts with a question word into an indirect question, we don't use if. So in conclusion, if we start a direct question with an auxiliary verb or a modal, the indirect question will contain if. And if we start a direct question with a question word, the indirect question has no if. And there are many different question words that we can use. Who, what, where, when, why, which, how much, how many, how long, how far, how much time, how many times, and how come. So let's look at some examples with direct questions starting with question words. What do you want to do? We're starting with a question word, so in the indirect question, we're not going to have if, and we need to remove the auxiliary verb do. Another example, what is her name? Notice that this time we're not using a subject, we're using a noun phrase, her name. So again, to make this an indirect sentence, we invert the auxiliary and the noun phrase. A more complicated example could be, who is the man with the golden gun? In this case, we have two options with the indirect version. We can say, do you know who the man is with the golden gun? Or we can say, do you know who the man with the golden gun is? Do you love me? We're starting with the auxiliary verb do in positive. So the indirect sentence needs if, but no do. Let's use the same direct question, but this time in the indirect phrase, let's use think. If we use think in the indirect phrase, we don't use if, we omit do. So we have, do you think you love me? Compare this with why do you love me? We have a question word at the start, so no if in the indirect version. And finally, why don't you love me? Don't is negative, so we invert the auxiliary verb and the subject to go from a direct question to an indirect question. A very common mistake is when students say, do you know what is the time? The direct question is what is the time? The indirect version is, do you know what the time is? Another way to ask this question could be, what time is it? And the indirect version could be, do you know what time it is? Another example using the auxiliary verb have could be, why hasn't he come to the cinema? It's a direct question. We're starting with a question word. So the indirect question could be, do you know why Inversion, why he hasn't come to the cinema? And the answer to that question could be, I don't know why. And then we have to remember that there's an inversion. He hasn't come to the cinema. And this is not a question. This is a declaration or a statement. And then let's compare that to a declaration without the indirect phrase. He hasn't come to the cinema. Using a different question word, we could say, how long or how much time will you need? If we want to be more polite, we could say, do you know how long or how much time you will need? Can you speak English? We're starting with a modal verb here, so we're going to have if in the indirect question. So if we wanted to be more polite, we could say, can you tell me if, and now inversion, you can speak English. What is your password? Where have you written it down? These are two direct questions, and we're going to convert them into one indirect question. So we can say, can you tell me what, now we're going to invert the auxiliary and the noun phrase, what your password is, and where, inversion, you have written it down. In conclusion, a direct question can start with any auxiliary or modal verb in positive or negative, plus a subject pronoun or noun phrase. But if we start with an indirect phrase, we add if and invert the subject and auxiliary. Subject first, auxiliary second. And if the auxiliary is do in positive, in an indirect sentence, we don't use the verb do, and we make changes to the main verb if necessary. If a direct question starts with a question word, the indirect sentence does not contain if. If an indirect phrase contains the verb think, the indirect question also doesn't contain if. Thanks for watching the video to the end. Please like and subscribe. And if you would like to help me make more videos in the future, please give me a super thanks here on YouTube or donate to my Patreon. The link is in the description.